I know how this sounds. I was standing in the Target parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon, 87 degrees, holding a bag of charcoal and a box of sparklers, when my sister called. She said, "Did you see what he posted?" I hadn't. I don't follow him on anything. I was trying to remember if I'd bought lighter fluid, and then she told me, "He's parked it in the driveway. He's got the keys on the kitchen counter." She was crying. I stood there in the heat and felt the plastic bag handles cutting into my palm, and I said, "What keys?" She said, "The BMW. He picked it up this morning." I heard the garage door open behind her on the phone. I heard his voice in the background. Then she hung up. I stood there for another minute. A woman in a silver Honda Odyssey pulled into the spot next to me and got out with a toddler on her hip. She smiled. I smiled back. I got in my car and drove home. I didn't turn on the radio. I just sat in the driveway for a while and watched the sun move across the windshield. I kept thinking about the credit inquiry I'd ignored 3 weeks before. I kept thinking about the email from Experian that I deleted without opening. I kept thinking about the file folder I'd left in the office, the one with the loan papers I'd signed. Except I hadn't. The first time the bank called, I was in the middle of approving a purchase order for sterile drapes. The woman on the phone said she was from the fraud department. I said I wasn't interested. She said, "This is regarding a recent credit application." I said I hadn't applied for anything. She said, "The account ending in 4421 was opened on May 3rd. I said she had the wrong number. I hung up. I didn't think about it again until she called back. The second time, I was in my car. I'd just left the hospital. I was sitting at the light on Elm and 3rd, the one that takes forever to turn green. She said, "Miss Harding, we've attempted to contact you 3 times now." I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." She said, "The loan was approved under your name and social security number. The vehicle was delivered to your address." I said, "What vehicle?" She said, "A BMW 5 Series. The first payment is overdue." The light turned green. I didn't move. The car behind me honked. I pulled over into the gas station lot and sat there with the engine running. I asked her to repeat the last 4 digits of the account. She did. I asked her to confirm the address. She did. I asked her what name was on the signature line. She said, "Claire Elizabeth Harding." I said, "I didn't sign that." She said, "I understand, ma'am. I'm just telling you what the paperwork shows." I said, "I'm telling you what the paperwork shows is a fraud." She said, "You'll need to file a police report." I said, "Okay." I didn't file a police report. I drove home. I pulled into the garage and sat there with the door closed and the engine off. I sat in the dark for a few minutes. Then I got out and walked into the house. Tom was on the couch. He had a beer on the coffee table and the game on. He looked up and said, "Hey, how was work?" I said, "Fine." He said, "You look tired." I said, "I'm fine." I walked past him into the kitchen. I opened the drawer where we keep the mail. I started going through it. There were credit card offers, a water bill, a flyer for a local roofing company. I pulled out a folded envelope with the bank's logo on it. I opened it. It was a welcome letter. It had my name on it. It had the account number. It had a sticker with a pin for the online portal. I stood there in the kitchen. I heard the TV in the living room. I heard the ice in his glass. I heard him laugh at something. I stood there and I thought about the kitchen table where we'd sat the week before. We'd talked about the new car. He'd said, "I'm going to look at a used sedan this weekend." I'd said, "I think my bonus comes in July." He'd said, "I'll handle it." I'd said, "Okay." I took the welcome letter back to the bedroom. I folded it and put it in the top drawer of my dresser, underneath my sweaters. I went back to the kitchen and started making dinner. He came in after a while and asked if I wanted a glass of wine. I said no. He said, "You sure? You seem off." I said, "I'm just tired." He said, "Okay." He opened a second beer and went back to the couch. That night, after he fell asleep, I got up and went into his office. He didn't have a password on his laptop. He never did. He said he didn't have anything to hide. I opened the browser history and found the loan application. I found the credit check. I found the digital signature. It was my name. It was written in a smooth, practiced cursive. It wasn't mine. I knew my signature. I'd signed 9,000 purchase orders. I could pick it out of a lineup. That one had the wrong slant. The loop on the C was too narrow. The H was too sharp. He'd done a good job, but he'd forgotten the little things. I closed the laptop. I went back to bed. I lay there in the dark and listened to him breathe. He had his back to me. He was sleeping the way he always slept, deep and quiet and untroubled. I felt a cold thing settle in my chest. It wasn't anger. It was something else. It was something like understanding. I understood that I didn't know him. I understood that I'd spent 18 years looking at a photograph and thinking it was the person in the frame. I understood that the photograph was taken so long ago that it didn't look like him anymore, and I'd just never noticed. I didn't sleep. I lay there until the first light came through the blinds. Then I got up and made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the backyard. The grass needed mowing. The roses were starting to bloom. I watched the light change, and I thought about what happens to a person when they stop being the person they thought they were. I thought about what you become when the story you've been telling yourself turns out to be someone else's script. I called a lawyer at 9. Not a friend. Not a recommendation. I picked a name off a billboard I'd driven past 100 times. I called and I said, "My husband took out a loan in my name. I need to know what I can do." The woman on the phone said, "Can you come in this afternoon?" I said yes. I said I'd be there at 2. Tom left for work at 7:30. He kissed my cheek on his way out. He said, "Love you." I said, "Love you too." It came out automatic. I didn't have to think about it. That was the part that scared me. Not that I was lying. That I'd been saying it that way for so long I didn't remember what it sounded like when I meant it. I sat at the kitchen table for an hour after he left. I looked at the wedding picture on the mantel. I was 26. He was 28. We were standing in front of the courthouse. We didn't have a big wedding. We didn't want one. We wanted to start our life. I looked at that picture and I thought, who are you? I looked at the girl in the picture and I thought, who were you? I didn't have an answer for either of them. I called my sister. Rachel picked up on the second ring. She said, "Hey, what's up?" I said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "You sound weird." I said, "Tom took out a car loan in my name. He forged my signature." There was a long pause. Then she said, "What do you mean forged?" I said, "I mean he signed my name on a loan application. He opened a credit account without telling me. The bank called this morning. They want their payment." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure." She said, "He wouldn't do that. That's not something he would do." I said, "I know how it sounds." She said, "No, I mean, that's a crime. He wouldn't commit a crime." I said, "He did." She said, "He probably just made a mistake. He probably thought you were going to sign it later." I said, "Rachel, he signed my name. He wrote it the way I write it. He just wrote it wrong." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to see a lawyer at 2. She said, "You should talk to him first." I said, "No." She said, "Claire, you've been married 18 years. You don't just go to a lawyer without talking to him." I said, "I'm not going to talk to him. I'm going to a lawyer." She said, "That's going to blow everything up." I said, "It's already blown up. I'm just trying to figure out where the pieces are." She said, "I'm coming over." I said, "No, don't. I'll call you after." She said, "I'm coming over." I said, "Don't." She said, "I'm coming over and I'm bringing wine." I said, "I don't want wine." She said, "You don't want wine? That's how I know you're not okay." I said, "I'll call you after." I hung up. The lawyer's office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a dry cleaner. I walked in and sat down in a chair that was older than me. The lawyer's name was Margaret. She was about 60. She had gray hair and reading glasses on a chain. She asked me to start from the beginning. I did. I told her about the bank call, the welcome letter, the laptop, the signature. She asked me what I wanted. I said, "I want the car." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because it's mine." She said, "Technically, yes. But you're also on the hook for the payments. If you want to keep it, you have to pay for it." I said, "I don't want to keep it. I want to get rid of it. But I want it gone on my terms." She said, "What terms?" I said, "I don't want to just discharge the loan. I want him to see it leave. I want him to know I was the one who made it go. She sat back in her chair. She looked at me. She said, how much of the story is you and how much of it is anger? I said, I don't know. What I do know is he made a decision about me without me. I want to make a decision about him without him. She said, okay. Let me tell you what the legal options are. You can file a police report. You can dispute the debt with the credit bureaus. You can sue him for the balance. Or you can repossess the car. I said, repossess, she said. It's in your name. You're the co-owner. You can take possession of the asset. You'd need to have it towed. I said, I don't have a license for that. She said, you don't need one. You need to arrange a tow truck and a copy of the loan papers. I said, and then what? She said, then you sell it. Or you let the bank take it. Either way, you're not liable for the payments once you surrender the vehicle. I said, what about him? She said, what about him? I said, he's still liable. She said, if his name is on the loan, yes. If it's just your name, it's just your problem. But if it's his name too, it's his problem too. I said, his name is on it. She said, then you have leverage. You can't discharge it without him. He can't discharge it without you. You're stuck together until one of you pays or one of you gives up the car. I said, I want to give up the car. She said, then call a tow truck. I asked her to draw up the paperwork. She said she'd have it ready in 3 days. I said, I want a copy of the original loan application. She said, you already have it. Your husband left it on his computer. I said, I want a certified copy. She said, I can get that. What's the date on it? I said, May 3rd. She said, I'll request it from the bank. They'll want a fraud affidavit. I said, will that trigger a report? She said, only if you want it to. You don't have to press charges. You just have to establish that you didn't authorize the application. I said, okay, do that. I walked out of the strip mall at 4:30. I got in my car and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel. I thought about Tom. I thought about the way he'd said love you that morning. I thought about the way he'd said it for 18 years. I thought about the way he'd said it when we were still young enough to believe that love was the same as honesty. I didn't know when it had changed. I didn't know if there had been a moment or a series of moments or just a slow drifting apart that I'd refused to see. I knew I'd refused to see a lot of things. I knew I'd refused to see the way he'd started coming home later. The way he'd started taking calls in the other room. The way he'd started looking at his phone with his thumb covering the screen. I'd seen all of it. I just hadn't looked. I drove home. I pulled into the driveway. The garage door was open. His truck was there. I parked next to it and got out. I walked into the house and he was standing in the kitchen. He had a spatula in his hand and a pan on the stove. He said, hey, I made dinner. It's steak. Your favorite. I said, thank you. He said, you look like you've had a long day. I said, I have. He said, sit down. I'll bring you a plate. I sat down at the table. I watched him move around the kitchen. He opened the oven. He pulled out a baking dish. He asked me if I wanted a glass of wine. I said yes this time. He poured it. He brought the plate over and sat down across from me. I looked at him. He looked back. He said, what? I said, nothing. He said, you've been weird all day. I said, I'm fine. He said, okay. He picked up his fork. He started eating. I watched him. I watched the way he cut his steak. The way he chewed. The way he moved his hand to reach for the salt. I watched him like he was a stranger I'd just met at a restaurant. I wondered if he could tell. I wondered if he looked at me and saw the same person he'd seen yesterday, or if he looked at me and saw something different and just didn't know what to call it. I said, the bank called me today. He stopped chewing. He put his fork down. He said, what bank? I said, the one that gave you the loan. He said, what loan? I said, the car loan. He said, I don't have a car loan. I said, you have a BMW. He said, I don't have a BMW. I said, there's a BMW in your name. There's a BMW in my name. There's a payment overdue. He said, that's not possible. I said, it's possible. I saw the paperwork. He said, Claire, I don't have a BMW. I said, you've got a BMW in the garage. He said, I've got a truck in the garage. I said, you've got a truck in the garage and a BMW in the driveway. He got up from the table. He walked over to the window. He pulled back the curtain and looked out. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned back to me. He said, "Okay. I need to tell you something." I said, "What?" He said, "I got the car for work. I was going to tell you. I just hadn't found the right time." I said, "You didn't get a car for work. You got a car with my name on it. You signed my name on the loan." He said, "I was going to pay you back. I got a bonus. It came through. I was going to pay the first few payments." I said, "That's not the point." He said, "What's the point?" I said, "The point is you forged my signature." He said, "I didn't forge it. I just signed it for you. I figured you'd be okay with it." I said, "You figured I'd be okay with it. You didn't ask me." He said, "I was going to ask you." I said, "When?" He said, "After I got it." I said, "You got it 3 weeks ago. It's been in the driveway." He said, "I know. I was waiting for the right time." I stood up. I walked to the sink. I stood there and looked out the window at the driveway. The BMW was sitting there. It was black. It had tinted windows. It was the most expensive thing we'd ever owned. I said, "What's the woman's name?" He said, "What?" I said, "The woman. The one you're buying the car for." "What's her name?" He said, "There's no woman." I said, "There's always a woman. When a man does something this stupid, there's always a woman." He said, "Claire, I got the car for work." I turned around. I looked at him. I said, "You got the car for work. You signed my name because you needed a cosigner. You didn't want to ask me. So you just did it. You put my credit on the line. You put my name on a legal document. And you didn't tell me because you were waiting for the right time." I said, "What else are you waiting for the right time to tell me?" He didn't answer. I said, "That's what I thought." I walked out of the kitchen. I went to the bedroom. I closed the door. I sat on the bed and listened to him move around the house. He didn't come after me. He didn't knock on the door. He cleaned up the kitchen. I heard the water running. I heard the dishes clatter. I heard him walk past the door and down the hall to his office. I heard the door close. I sat there until it got dark. Then I got up and opened my laptop. I looked up tow truck companies. I found one that was open 24 hours. I saved the number. I closed the laptop. I lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something and I couldn't see the bottom. I didn't know if I was going to jump or walk away. I knew I wasn't going to stay where I was. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. Tom was already gone. His side of the bed was cold. I sat up and looked at the window. The light was gray and flat. I got up and walked to the kitchen. There was a note on the counter. It said, "Had to go in early. We'll talk tonight. I love you." I read it 3 times. I folded it and put it in my pocket. I didn't go to work. I called in sick. I said I had a migraine. I sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and stared at the BMW in the driveway. I thought about the tow truck number I'd saved on my laptop. I thought about the lawyer. I thought about my sister. I thought about the woman I didn't know the name of. I thought about all the things I didn't know and all the things I'd chosen not to know and all the things I was about to find out whether I wanted to or not. Rachel showed up at 9. She didn't call first. She just walked in through the back door with a bag of pastries and a look on her face like she'd been up all night. She said, "I brought croissants." I said, "I don't want a croissant." She said, "Too bad." She put the bag on the counter and pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. She said, "Tell me everything." I said, "I told you everything yesterday." She said, "You told me the facts. I want the rest." I said, "The rest is I don't know what to do." She said, "What did the lawyer say?" I said, "She said I can repossess the car." Rachel said, "Repossess? You can't repossess your own car." I said, "It's in my name. It's my debt. I can take it back." She said, "That's insane. That's a divorce move." I said, "Maybe that's what this is." She said, "You're not getting divorced." I said, "I don't know what I'm doing. I just know I can't let him get away with it." She said, "You're not going to let him get away with it. But you're not going to tow his car in front of the neighbors." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because that's crazy." I said, "He forged my name on a loan. That's also crazy. She said, I know. I know. But you have to think about how this looks. I said, I don't care how it looks. I care about what's true. And the truth is he did something to me that he didn't have the right to do. And I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen so everyone can feel comfortable at the next barbecue. Rachel looked at me. She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, You've been mad before. I've seen you mad. This isn't mad. I said, What is it? She said, I don't know. But it's something else. I said, It's not being mad. It's being done. She said, Done with what? I said, Done with being the one who fixes everything. Done with being the one who makes it okay. Done with being the one who cleans up the mess and smiles and says it's fine when it's not fine. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. She said, Okay. What do you need? I said, I need you to not talk me out of it. She said, I'm not talking you out of it. I'm just trying to understand. I said, You don't have to understand. You just have to let me do it. She pulled her hand back. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, What are you going to do about the woman? I said, What woman? She said, The one you asked him about last night. Did he tell you her name? I said, He didn't tell me anything. He just said there wasn't one. Rachel said, Do you believe him? I said, No. She said, Then what are you going to do about it? I said, I'm going to find out. But I'm not going to find out from him. I called the lawyer at 10. Margaret picked up on the first ring. She said, I was about to call you. I have the certified copy of the loan application. It came through this morning. I said, Can I come get it? She said, You can. But I also have some information you might want to hear. The bank flagged the account. They think there's a pattern. I said, What pattern? She said, There's a second account. It's in your husband's name only. It's been open for about 8 months. It has a separate mailing address. I sat down. I didn't realize I'd been standing. I said, What's the address? She said, I can give it to you. I can also tell you who's on the account. It's a joint account with a woman named Monica. I said, Monica who? She said, Monica Ortega. She's listed as a co-owner on a credit card associated with the account. It's a separate financial identity. I said, Where is it? She said, The address is on Maple Street. Unit 204. It's an apartment complex. I said, How long has it been open? She said, Since October. The credit card is used for groceries and utilities. There are some restaurant charges. Movie tickets. Nothing that screams affair. But it's a shared account with a shared address. I said, He's had an apartment since October. She said, It looks that way. I hung up. I looked at Rachel. She was watching me. She said, What? I said, He has an apartment. It's been open since October. She said, An apartment? You mean a place he stays? I said, A place he stays with someone. She said, Who? I said, Someone named Monica. Rachel said, Monica Ortega. I said, You know her? She said, She works for his company. She's the regional manager out of Phoenix. She transferred in last year. I said, How do you know that? She said, Tom mentioned her at the Christmas party. He said she was impressive. He said she had a lot of energy. I said, He said she had a lot of energy. Rachel said, I didn't think anything of it. I said, Of course you didn't. Why would you? She said, Claire, I'm sorry. I said, Don't be sorry. Just tell me what else he said about her. Rachel thought about it. She said, He said she was good at her job. He said she was going to be promoted soon. He said she didn't take things personally. I said, Didn't take things personally. Rachel said, I didn't know what that meant. I said, It means she didn't care if he was married. I got in my car and drove to Maple Street. I didn't tell Rachel where I was going. I just got up and walked out. She said, Claire, wait. I said, I'll be back. She said, Where are you going? I said, I need to see something. She said, Don't do anything stupid. I said, I'm not going to do anything stupid. I'm going to look at an apartment. She said, That sounds stupid. I said, It sounds like information. The apartment complex was on the west side of town, near the highway. It was a beige building with a pool and a laundry room. I parked across the street and sat there with the engine running. I looked at Unit 204. The blinds were drawn. There was a white Honda Civic in the parking lot. I didn't know if it was hers. I didn't know if she was home. I didn't know what I was going to do if she opened the door. I just sat there and watched the building and waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. I sat there for 40 minutes. The sun got higher. The parking lot filled up. People came and went with laundry baskets and grocery bags. A man in a blue polo shirt walked his dog. A woman in a bathrobe got her mail. No one came out of Unit 204. No one went in. I drove home. I pulled into the driveway and parked behind Tom's truck. I sat there for a minute. Then I got out and walked inside. Rachel was still at the kitchen table. She had a cup of coffee in front of her. She said, "You were gone a long time." I said, "I sat outside her apartment." She said, "What happened?" I said, "Nothing. No one came out." She said, "What were you going to do if someone did?" I said, "I don't know. I guess I was going to see what she looked like." Rachel said, "And then what?" I said, "And then I was going to see if I could figure out why he chose her." She said, "Are you sure you want to know?" I said, "I'm not sure of anything. I just know I can't stop thinking about it. I think about him signing my name. I think about him standing at the kitchen counter with the pen in his hand. I think about him driving the car off the lot. I think about him coming home and kissing me and saying, 'Love you,' and going to bed like nothing happened. I think about him waking up the next morning and doing it again." I said, "I can't stop thinking about the fact that he did it and he didn't feel a thing." Rachel said, "You don't know that." I said, "I know he didn't tell me. I know he didn't ask. I know he didn't leave a note or send a text or do anything that would have given me a chance to say no. He just did it. He made a decision about my life without me." I said, "That's not love. That's not even disrespect. That's treating someone like they're not a person." She got up and came over to me. She put her arms around me. I stood there stiff for a second. Then I let go. I leaned into her and I felt my shoulders shake. I didn't cry. I just shook. She held on. She said, "You're okay. You're okay." I said, "I'm not okay. But I'm going to be." The next few days were quiet. Tom came home at normal hours. He made dinner. He asked me how my day was. I said fine. He said we should talk about the car. I said okay. He said he was going to sell it. He said he was going to pay back the loan. He said he was sorry. I said okay. He said, "Are you going to say anything else?" I said, "What do you want me to say?" He said, "I want you to say you forgive me." I said, "I can't say that." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I don't know if I do." He said, "I made a mistake." I said, "You made a mistake. You didn't ask me." He said, "I know. That's why I'm sorry." I said, "Being sorry doesn't fix it." He said, "What does?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe nothing." He looked at me. He had that look. The one he got when he was trying to figure out how to get what he wanted. I'd seen it 1,000 times. I'd always given in. I'd always said okay. I'd always believed that keeping the peace was the same as being loved. I didn't believe that anymore. I said, "Who's Monica?" He flinched. It was small. It was almost invisible. But I saw it. He said, "Who?" I said, "Monica Ortega. The regional manager. The one you share an apartment with." He said, "I don't share an apartment with anyone." I said, "Unit 204. Maple Street. The credit card in both your names." He said, "That's not what it looks like." I said, "I didn't say what it looked like. I just said, 'Who is she?'" He didn't answer. He just stood there. I watched him try to think of something to say. I watched the gears turn. I watched him decide what to do with his face. He went with shame. He dropped his head. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "You already said that." He said, "It's not what you think." I said, "I don't know what I think. That's the problem. I don't know anything. I don't know who you are. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing sitting here talking to you like you're still the person I married." He looked up. He said, "I love you." I said, "You don't get to say that. You don't get to say that and then do the things you did. You don't get to say that and then sign my name. You don't get to say that and then go to an apartment on Maple Street and come home and kiss me and act like everything's fine." I said, "You don't get to say that. You used that word up." He reached for me. I stepped back. He said, "Claire." I said, Don't touch me." He put his hand down. He said, "I'll sell the car. I'll sell it tomorrow. I'll pay off the loan. I'll end it with Monica. I'll do whatever you want. I said, I don't want you to do whatever I want. I want you to have done the right thing in the first place. I want you to have looked at me and thought, she deserves to know. I want you to have been the person I thought you were. I said, you're not that person. I don't know if you ever were. I walked out of the kitchen. I went to the bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the bed. I heard him walk around the house. I heard him open the front door. I heard him leave. I didn't get up to see where he went. I just sat there and looked at my hands. They were shaking. I put them flat on my knees and pressed down until they stopped. The next morning, I got up early. I made coffee. I pulled out the lawyer's letter. I looked at the copy of the loan application. I looked at my signature. The one that wasn't mine. I looked at the date. May 3rd. I looked at the car. The black BMW in the driveway. I walked out the back door and stood on the patio and looked at it. It was a beautiful car. It was the kind of car people bought to show everyone they'd made it. It was the kind of car people bought when they wanted to be seen. He'd bought it to be seen. He'd bought it to drive to the apartment on Maple Street. He'd bought it to impress a woman named Monica. He'd bought it with my name on the dotted line. I went inside and called the tow truck company. I said I needed a flatbed. I said I needed it at 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. They said they could do that. I gave them the address. I hung up. I sat down at the kitchen table. I looked at the calendar. Saturday was the barbecue at Rachel's house. She'd planned it for weeks. She'd invited the whole family. Tom had said he'd be there. I'd said I'd bring potato salad. I called Rachel. I said, I'm going to do it on Saturday. She said, do what? I said, the car. I'm having it towed from your driveway. She said, what? No. That's my house. That's where we're having the barbecue. I said, I know. That's why I'm doing it there. She said, Claire, you can't be serious. That's insane. That's public. I said, that's the point. She said, you're going to humiliate him in front of everyone. I said, he humiliated me in private for 8 months. He signed my name. He opened an account. He bought a car. He got an apartment. He did all of that without telling me. He treated me like I wasn't there. I'm just making sure everyone knows I exist. She said, what about me? What about the neighbors? What about the kids? I said, there are no kids. There's just you and me and him and the truth. She said, I don't want this at my house. I said, I know. I'm sorry. But I need to do it. I need to do it where people can see. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, okay. I said, okay. She said, okay. But you're bringing the potato salad. I said, I'll bring the potato salad. She said, and you're telling me exactly what happens. I want to know everything. I said, I'll tell you everything. She said, I still think you're crazy. I said, I know. That's why you're my sister. The rest of the week passed like a slow tide. I went to work. I approved purchase orders. I went to meetings. I came home. Tom was there sometimes. He slept on the couch. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He just said, I'm going to fix this. I said, okay. I didn't ask how. I didn't care. I was past caring. I was past the point where his promises meant anything to me. I was past the point where I believed he could do anything other than what he'd already done. Thursday night, I was sitting in the living room. He came in and stood in the doorway. He said, can we talk? I said, we can talk. He sat down across from me. He said, I know you think I don't care. I know you think I just went out and did all of this without thinking. But I did think. I thought about it a lot. I thought about what it would do to you. I thought about how you'd react. I thought about all of it. He said, I just wanted something for myself. Is that so wrong? I said, you wanted something for yourself. So you took my name. You took my credit. You took my trust. You took my marriage. You took all of it. And you gave me nothing. He said, I told you I'd pay you back. I said, you told me you'd pay me back. That's not the point. The point is you took something that wasn't yours. The point is you made a decision about my life and you didn't include me. The point is you don't get to say you wanted something for yourself when what you wanted was built out of pieces of me. He said, I didn't see it that way. I said, I know you didn't. That's the problem. I stood up. I walked past him. I went to the bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the bed and looked at the ceiling. I thought about Saturday. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the look on his face when he saw it. I thought about the neighbors. I thought about my sister. I thought about all the people who were going to watch and wonder and whisper. I didn't care. I was past caring. I was past the point where what other people thought mattered more than what I knew. I knew what he did. I knew he'd done it on purpose. I knew he'd done it because he thought he could get away with it. I knew he'd done it because he thought I wouldn't fight back. I knew he'd done it because he'd stopped seeing me as someone who could hurt him. I was going to show him I could. I was going to show him I could do a lot worse than hurt him. I was going to take the car. I was going to take it in front of everyone. I was going to hand him the paperwork and let him read it out loud. I was going to watch his face as the flatbed lifted his new BMW off the ground. I was going to stand there and not say a word. I was going to let the silence do the talking. I lay down on the bed. I closed my eyes. I didn't sleep. I just lay there and listened to the house settle around me. I listened to the pipes creak. I listened to the fridge hum. I listened to the sound of Tom moving around in the living room. I waited for the sun to come up. I waited for Saturday to come. I waited for the moment when everything I'd been holding in my chest would finally have a place to go. Friday night, he went out. He said he had to meet someone about the car. He said he had a buyer. He said he'd be back late. I said okay. I didn't tell him about the tow truck. I didn't tell him about the paperwork. I didn't tell him anything. I let him walk out the door and I sat on the couch and I waited. I waited for him to come back. I waited for the next day. I waited for the thing I knew was coming. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't angry anymore. I was something else. I was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. I was the kind of still that happens when you've made a decision and you know there's no going back. I got up at 6 on Saturday morning. I made a pot of coffee. I looked at the potato salad in the fridge. I looked at the loaf of bread on the counter. I looked at my reflection in the window. I didn't look different. I didn't look like someone who was about to do something monumental. I looked like me. I looked like Claire Harding, procurement officer, wife, sister, daughter. I looked like the person I'd always been. But I wasn't that person anymore. I didn't know who I was. I knew I was about to find out. The tow truck was scheduled for 4. I had the paperwork in my bag. I had the keys to the BMW in my pocket. He'd left them on the counter the night before. I'd picked them up and put them in my purse and he hadn't noticed. He hadn't noticed a lot of things. I was about to make sure he noticed this. I drove to Rachel's at 3. I parked in the driveway. I went inside and set down the potato salad. Rachel was in the kitchen. She was wearing an apron. She said, "You're early." I said, "I wanted to get here before everyone else." She said, "The tow truck's at 4. I said, 4. She said, "Are you sure about this?" I said, "I've never been more sure of anything." She looked at me. She said, "Okay. I'm going to have a drink. I think I need one." I said, "I'll have one too." The barbecue started at 3:30. I stood in Rachel's kitchen and watched people drift through the back door. My Uncle Earl brought a 6-pack of cheap beer and a folding chair. My cousin Diane came with her husband and 2 kids. The kids ran straight for the trampoline in the backyard. The adults clustered around the grill. Tom showed up at 3:45. He walked in through the side gate. He was wearing a polo shirt and shorts. He looked like he'd just come from a golf game. He saw me in the kitchen and he smiled. He came over and said, "Hey, you made it." I said, "I made it." He said, "I brought the car. The BMW." I thought I'd show it to Uncle Earl. He's been asking about it. I said, "Okay." He said, "You okay? You look nervous." I said, "I'm fine." "Go show him the car." He went outside. I watched him walk across the yard. He stopped by the grill and said something to my uncle. They both laughed. He gestured toward the driveway. My uncle put down his spatula and followed him. Tom led him around the side of the house. I heard the car door open. I heard my uncle whistle. Rachel came up behind me. She said, "He's showing off the car." I said, "I know." She said, "You want me to call the tow truck early?" I said, "No." 4. She said, "It's almost 4. I said, "I know." I walked outside. I stood on the patio and watched Tom and my uncle admire the BMW. Tom was leaning against the hood. He was explaining something. His hands were moving. He was telling a story. My uncle was nodding. I watched him and I felt a strange calm wash over me. I felt like I was watching someone on a screen. Like I wasn't really there. Like I was a person who had already done the thing she was about to do and was just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The tow truck pulled up at 4 o'clock on the dot. It came around the corner and rolled to a stop in front of the driveway. It was a white flatbed with yellow lettering on the side. The driver got out. He was a man in his 50s with a gray beard and a cap that said, Premier Towing. He walked up to me. He said, "You the one who called?" I said, "I'm the one." He said, "Which vehicle?" I pointed. He said, "That the one." I said, "That's the one." He said, "I need the paperwork." I opened my bag and handed him the certified copy of the loan application. He looked at it. He said, "You're the co-owner." I said, "I'm the owner." He said, "The loan's in your name." I said, "It's in my name. The other name is my husband's. He's not the one calling." He said, "I don't care who's calling. I just need to see the documentation." I said, "You've got it." He walked over to the BMW. Tom was standing there with his mouth open. He looked at me. He looked at the driver. He said, "What is this?" I said, "It's a tow truck." He said, "Why is it here?" I said, "It's here for the car." He said, "The car's not being towed." I said, "The car is being towed." He said, "Claire, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm repossessing my property." He said, "You can't repossess something you own." I said, "I can repossess something that's in my name. And this car is in my name. You put it in my name. You signed my name." I walked over to him. I pulled the folded papers from my bag. I handed them to him. I said, "That's the loan application. I want you to look at page 1. Look at the signature line." He took the papers. He looked at them. He turned pale. He said, "Claire, let's talk about this inside." I said, "We're not talking inside. We're talking right here." He said, "You're making a scene." I said, "You made a scene when you forged my name. You made a scene when you opened an account in my name. You made a scene when you bought a car with my credit. I'm just making sure everyone knows who's in the scene." The neighbors had started to gather. I could see them on the other side of the fence. Mrs. Hartwell from next door was standing on her back porch with a glass of iced tea. The Gordons from across the street were walking their dog. My Uncle Earl was standing by the grill with his mouth open. My cousin Diane had her phone out. I didn't care. The tow truck driver said, "Ma'am, I need you to confirm the vehicle one more time." I said, "Black BMW. 5 Series. License plate Zulu 47 Tango." He said, "That matches the paperwork." He walked around to the driver's side door. He looked at me. He said, "You have the keys." I said, "I have the keys." I pulled them out of my pocket. I held them up. Tom said, "Those are my keys." I said, "They're the keys to a car that's in my name. They're my keys." I handed them to the driver. He got in the car. The engine started. He put it in neutral and rolled it back a few feet. Then he got out and walked around to the back of the flatbed. He lowered the ramp. He got back in the BMW and drove it up the ramp. The car groaned as it rolled onto the metal. The driver cut the engine and climbed out. He walked back to me. He said, "You want it taken to the address on the paperwork?" I said, "I want it taken to the impound lot." He said, "You'll need to sign a release." I said, "I'll sign it." I signed the release. The driver folded the paperwork and put it in his pocket. He walked back to the tow truck and climbed into the cab. The engine started. The flatbed began to lift. I watched the BMW rise off the ground. The tires cleared the asphalt. The car hung there for a second, suspended. Then the driver pulled forward and drove away. I stood in the driveway and watched it go. The taillights blinked once as the truck turned the corner. Then it was gone. I turned around. Tom was standing there. He had the papers in his hand. He looked at me. He said, "You just took my car." I said, "I just took my car." He said, "It's my car. I paid for it." I said, "You paid for it with my name. You paid for it with my credit. You paid for it with my signature. That's not paying. That's stealing." He said, "I was going to pay you back." I said, "You were going to pay me back. You said that. You said it a lot. But you didn't do it. You didn't do anything except take what wasn't yours and tell me you'd make it right later. You don't get to do that. You don't get to take something and then say you'll fix it. You have to fix it first. You have to do the thing before you take the thing. You don't get to take the thing and then ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness comes after. And you're not there yet. He said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "I want you to go inside and talk to your wife. I want you to look her in the eye and tell her what you did. I want you to tell her about Monica. I want you to tell her about the apartment. I want you to tell her about the money. I want you to tell her everything. And then I want you to leave." He said, "Leave," I said, "leave the house. Leave the marriage. Leave me alone. I don't want to see you. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want you to come back. I want you to go and I want you to stay gone." He stood there. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. I saw something flicker in his eyes. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was confusion. He didn't understand what had just happened. He didn't understand that I had done something he couldn't undo. He didn't understand that I had taken something from him the way he had taken something from me. I said, "I have more papers. I have a divorce petition. I have a financial separation agreement. I have a list of every asset we own and every debt we owe. I have an accounting of everything you spent on that car and that apartment and that woman. I know how much you spent. I know where it came from. I know what you took from me and what you gave to her. I know all of it." He said, "You hired a lawyer." I said, "I hired a lawyer. I hired a lawyer the day I found out about the loan. I hired a lawyer because I knew you wouldn't tell me the truth. I hired a lawyer because I knew you would lie. I hired a lawyer because I knew you would try to talk me out of it. And I was right. You did try to talk me out of it. You told me you loved me. You told me you were sorry. You told me you'd fix it. But you didn't fix it. You just waited. You waited for me to calm down. You waited for me to forgive you. You waited for me to go back to being the person who let you do whatever you wanted. And I'm not that person anymore. I don't know if I ever was that person. I think I just thought I was." He said, "I didn't mean to hurt you." I said, "I know you didn't. That's the worst part. You didn't mean to hurt me. You just didn't care if you did. You did what you wanted and you hoped I wouldn't find out. And I did find out. And I did something about it. And now you have to live with the consequences." Rachel came out of the house. She stood on the back porch. She looked at me. She looked at Tom. She said, "I think you should go." Tom said, "Rachel, this is between me and Claire." Rachel said, "I know it is. And I think you should go." He looked at me. He said, "Claire." I said, "Go." He walked away. He walked down the driveway and turned onto the sidewalk. He didn't look back. I stood there and watched him go. I felt the sun on my shoulders. I felt the heat coming off the pavement. I felt the silence settle around me. My Uncle Earl walked over. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "You okay?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "That was something." I said, "That was something." He said, "You want a beer?" I said, "No. I want a drink. A real drink." He said, "Rachel's got whiskey." I said, "I'll take it." I walked back to the house. The neighbors were still standing there. I didn't look at them. I walked through the back door and into the kitchen. I opened the cabinet and pulled down a bottle of Jameson. I poured a glass. I didn't add ice. I didn't add water. I just drank it. I felt it burn going down. I felt it settle in my chest. I felt the heat spread through my body. Rachel came in. She closed the door behind her. She said, "You just did that." I said, "I just did that." She said, "I can't believe you just did that." I said, "I can't believe I just did that either." She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I don't know. I feel like I just did something I can't undo. I feel like I just made a decision that changed everything. I feel like I just burned a bridge and I'm standing on the other side and I don't know if I'm safe or not." She poured herself a glass. She sat down across from me. She said, "You're safe." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because I'm here." "Because you're here." "Because the car is gone and he's gone and you're still standing. That's what safe looks like. You're still standing." I sat there and drank my whiskey. I listened to the sounds of the barbecue coming through the walls. I could hear the kids laughing on the trampoline. I could hear my Uncle Earl talking to someone about the car. I could hear the normal sounds of a Saturday afternoon. I said, I didn't tell him about Monica. Rachel said, you didn't. I said, I didn't. I wanted him to know that I know. But I didn't say her name. I wanted him to wonder. She said, wonder what? I said, wonder how much I know. Wonder what I'm going to do next. Wonder if I'm going to show up at the apartment. Wonder if I'm going to call her. I want him to spend the next week wondering what I'm going to do. She said, that's cruel. I said, it's not cruel. It's leverage. He had leverage over me for 8 months. He had leverage over me the whole time I didn't know. He had leverage over me when he signed my name. He had leverage over me when he drove that car off the lot. He had leverage over me when he came home and kissed me and went to bed. Now I have leverage. Now I'm the one who knows something he doesn't. And I'm going to use it. She looked at me. She said, you're not the same person. I said, I know. I'm not. She said, what happened to her? I said, she went with the car. She went with the keys. She went with the signature. She's gone. I don't know who she was. I don't know if she was real. I think she was just someone I made up to get through the day. I finished my whiskey. I set the glass down. I looked at Rachel. I said, I'm going to go home now. She said, stay. There's food. There's people. You don't have to talk to anyone. I said, I know. But I want to go home. I want to be alone. I want to sit in my house and look at the empty driveway and think about what I just did. She said, okay. But call me later. I said, I'll call you later. I drove home. The sun was starting to go down. The sky was orange and pink. I pulled into the driveway and looked at the spot where the BMW used to be. It was empty. The asphalt was clean. There were no tire marks. There was no sign that anything had ever been there. I sat in the car for a minute. Then I got out and walked into the house. The house was dark. I turned on the lights. I walked through the rooms. The living room. The kitchen. The bedroom. I opened the closet. Half of Tom's clothes were gone. I didn't know when he'd taken them. I didn't know if he'd taken them. I hadn't noticed. I hadn't been paying attention. I sat down on the bed. I looked at the empty closet. I looked at the empty driveway. I looked at the empty house. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the car. I thought about the look on Tom's face when the car lifted off the ground. I thought about the way he'd walked away. I thought about the way he hadn't looked back. I lay down on the bed. I closed my eyes. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't know if I was going to call the lawyer. I didn't know if I was going to file the divorce papers. I didn't know if I was going to show up at the apartment on Maple Street. I didn't know anything except that I wasn't the same person I'd been that morning. I wasn't the same person who'd woken up in this bed and looked in the mirror and seen someone who was still trying to hold it together. I was someone else. I was someone who had done something. I was someone who had taken action. I was someone who had made a decision and watched it happen and hadn't looked away. I got up. I walked to the kitchen. I poured another glass of whiskey. I sat at the table and looked at the window. The dark was coming down. The streetlights were starting to come on. I sat there and I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I knew it wasn't Tom. I knew it wasn't an apology. I knew it wasn't a way back to the way things were. I was waiting for something else. I was waiting for the next thing. I was waiting to see who I was going to become. The phone rang. I picked it up. It was Rachel. She said, you okay? I said, I think so. She said, I just got a call from Diane. She posted the video online. It's already been shared 40 times. I said, what video? She said, the car getting towed. She was filming the whole thing. I said, I saw her with her phone. She said, it's on Facebook. It's on Instagram. It's on Nextdoor. The neighbors are commenting. I said, what are they saying? She said, they're saying you're crazy. They're saying you're brave. They're saying they don't know what happened, but they're glad they weren't in your shoes. I said, that's about right. She said, you're famous. I said, I'm not famous. I'm just the woman who had her husband's car towed. She said, you're famous. And I'm going to get you a drink. I said, I already have one. She said, good. We hung up. I sat there and looked at my phone. I had 17 notifications. I didn't open them. I didn't want to know what people were saying. I didn't want to know what they thought. I wanted to sit in the quiet and let the night settle around me. I finished my drink. I put the glass in the sink. I went back to the bedroom and changed into my pajamas. I lay down in the bed and looked at the ceiling. The fan was moving. The air was warm. I felt my body relax. I felt my eyes close. I didn't know if I was going to sleep. I didn't know if I was going to lie there all night and think. I just knew I wasn't going to get up. I wasn't going to check my phone. I wasn't going to call him. I wasn't going to do anything except let myself be still. The phone rang again. I picked it up. It was Tom. I looked at his name on the screen. I thought about answering. I thought about not answering. I let it ring. I let it go to voicemail. I put the phone down. He called again. I let it ring. He called again. I let it ring. He called again. I let it ring. I turned off the phone. I put it on the nightstand. I lay back down. I closed my eyes. I listened to the sound of the fan. I listened to the sound of my own breathing. I listened to the sound of the night. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the way it had looked rising off the ground. I thought about the way the driver had said, "That's the one." I thought about the way I'd handed him the keys. I thought about the way I'd signed the release. I thought about the way I'd stood there and watched it go. I thought about Monica. I thought about the apartment. I thought about the credit card. I thought about all the things I didn't know and all the things I was going to find out. I thought about my name. I thought about the signature on the loan application. I thought about the way Tom had written it. I thought about the way he'd tried to make it look like mine. I thought about how he'd failed. I thought about the divorce. I thought about the financial separation. I thought about the legal proceedings. I thought about the road ahead. I didn't know what it looked like. I knew it was going to be long. I knew it was going to be hard. I knew I was going to have to do things I didn't want to do. But I also knew something else. I knew I wasn't going to be afraid. I knew I wasn't going to back down. I knew I wasn't going to let him win. I thought about the woman who had stood in the Target parking lot holding a bag of charcoal and a box of sparklers. I thought about the woman who had listened to her sister cry on the phone. I thought about the woman who had driven home and sat in the driveway and watched the sun move across the windshield. I thought about the woman who had called the lawyer. I thought about the woman who had sat outside the apartment on Maple Street. I thought about the woman who had called the tow truck. I thought about her and I realized she was me. She was me and she was gone. She had done what she needed to do and now she was gone. I was someone else. I was someone who had done something. I was someone who had acted. I was someone who had made a decision and watched it happen. I was someone who wasn't going to stop. I fell asleep. I slept through the night. I didn't dream. I didn't wake up. I just slept. I woke up the next morning to the sun coming through the window. I lay there for a minute. I looked at the ceiling. I looked at the clock. It was 8:30. I got up. I walked to the kitchen. I made coffee. I opened the back door and stepped outside. The air was cool. The birds were singing. I stood on the patio and looked at the empty driveway. I thought about the hook from the night before. The one that had been at the end of the last scene. I thought about it and I felt a strange sense of peace. The car was gone. The weight was gone. The thing that had been sitting in my chest was gone. I sat down on the steps. I drank my coffee. I watched the sun come up. I thought about the next thing. I was going to find out about Monica. I was going to find out about the apartment. I was going to find out everything he hadn't told me. And then I was going to make a decision. I was going to do what I had to do. I was going to take what I needed to take. I was going to fight for what was mine. I thought about the car. I thought about the look on his face. I thought about the neighbors. I thought about the video on Facebook. I thought about all of it. I took a sip of my coffee. I was ready for the next thing. The next day was Sunday. I spent it in the backyard. I pulled weeds. I pruned the roses. I mowed the lawn. I did the things I'd been putting off for months. I let my hands get dirty. I let my mind go blank. The sun moved across the sky and I moved with it. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't check my messages. I just worked. Rachel came over in the afternoon. She brought sandwiches. She sat on the patio and watched me pull thistles out of the flower bed. She said, "You're going to kill yourself." I said, "I'm going to kill the weeds." She said, "You've been out here for 6 hours." I said, "It needed to be done." She said, "The yard didn't need to be done. You needed to be doing something." I said, "Same thing." She opened the bag of sandwiches and pulled out a turkey club. She held it up. I shook my head. I said, "I'm not hungry." She said, "Eat." I said, "I don't want to." She said, "I don't care." I walked over and sat down. I took the sandwich and ate it. I didn't taste it. I just chewed and swallowed. She said, "Have you talked to him?" I said, "No." She said, "He's been calling me. He's been calling Mom. He's been calling everyone." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to call the lawyer tomorrow. I'm going to file the petition. I'm going to start the process." She said, "You're sure?" I said, "I'm sure." She said, "What about the car?" I said, "It's at the impound lot. The bank will pick it up." I signed it over. I don't have to worry about it anymore. She said, "What about the debt?" I said, "It's still there. It's in both our names. But the car is gone. The bank can't come after me for something I don't have. I'm not liable for the balance once I surrender the vehicle." She said, "You looked that up?" I said, "I looked that up." She said, "What about Monica?" I said, "I haven't done anything about Monica." She said, "Are you going to?" I said, "I don't know. I don't know if I need to." She said, "You don't want to know what happened?" I said, "I know what happened. He had an affair. He opened an apartment. He spent money. He lied. I don't need to know the details. I know enough." She looked at me. She said, "That's not true." I said, "What's not true?" She said, "You need to know. You need to know everything. You need to know so you can stop wondering. You need to know so you can stop making up worse things in your head." I said, "I don't think I can handle worse." She said, "That's why you need to know. Because you're already handling worse. You're just doing it alone." I finished my sandwich. I brushed the crumbs off my lap. I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "You think about it. You'll do what you need to do." She left at 5. I went back to the weeds. I worked until the sun went down. I went inside and took a shower. I stood under the hot water and let it run over me. I closed my eyes. I thought about the apartment on Maple Street. I thought about Monica. I thought about the credit card. I thought about all the things I didn't know. I got out of the shower. I put on my pajamas. I sat on the couch and turned on the TV. I didn't watch it. I just listened to the noise. I stared at the wall. I thought about what Rachel had said. I picked up my phone. I scrolled through my contacts. I found the name. Monica Ortega. I had it from the lawyer. I looked at it. I thought about calling her. I thought about what I would say. I thought about whether I would say anything at all. I put the phone down. I picked it up again. I typed her number into a text message. I wrote, "This is Claire Harding. I think we need to talk." I stared at it. I deleted it. I put the phone down. I picked it up again. I called the lawyer. Margaret answered. I said, "I need the address again. The apartment." She said, "I can send it to you." I said, "Send it." She said, "Are you going to do something?" I said, "I'm going to look." She said, "Okay. I'll send it." I said, "Thank you." The address came through. I looked at it. I knew it already. I'd sat outside it. I didn't need to see it again. I just wanted to have it in my hand. I wanted to know it was real. I didn't go that night. I went the next morning. I got up early. I showered. I put on jeans and a jacket. I drove across town. I parked in the same spot across the street. I looked at Unit 204. The blinds were still drawn. The white Honda Civic was still there. I sat there for 10 minutes. I sat there for 20. I sat there for 30. The door opened. A woman came out. She was in her late 30s. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing a blazer and slacks. She was carrying a laptop bag. She locked the door behind her and walked to the white Honda. She got in and started the engine. I got out of my car. I walked across the street. I stood in front of the Civic. She looked up. She saw me. She rolled down the window. She said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I'm Claire Harding. I think you know who I am." She looked at me. Her face didn't change. She said, "I know who you are." I said, "I want to talk to you." She said, I don't think that's a good idea. I said, I don't care what you think. I need to talk to you. She sat there for a minute. She looked at me. She looked at her phone. She said, okay. Get in. I said, I'm not getting in your car. I'll meet you somewhere. She said, where? I said, the coffee shop on the corner. She said, okay. I'll be there in 5 minutes. She drove away. I walked to the coffee shop. I ordered a black coffee. I sat at a table in the back. I waited. She came in 5 minutes later. She didn't order anything. She walked over and sat down across from me. She looked at me. I looked at her. She was pretty. She was professional. She looked like someone who knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to take it. I hated her. I hated her because she looked like someone I could have been friends with. She said, I'm sorry you found out the way you did. I said, I'm sorry I found out at all. She said, I didn't want to hurt you. I said, you didn't want to hurt me. You just didn't care if you did. She said, that's not true. I said, it is true. If you had cared, you wouldn't have done it. You wouldn't have been with a married man. You wouldn't have shared an apartment. You wouldn't have spent his money. You wouldn't have done any of it. You did it because you wanted to. And you didn't think about me. You thought about yourself. She said, I'm not going to apologize. I said, I don't want an apology. I don't want anything from you. I just want to know what happened. She said, why? I said, because I need to know. I need to know who he was when he wasn't with me. I need to know what he told you. I need to know what he said about me. I need to know everything. She leaned back in her chair. She looked at me. She said, he told me you didn't understand him. He said you were focused on work. He said you didn't make him feel seen. He said he was lonely. I said, he said he was lonely. She said, he said you didn't notice him. He said you didn't pay attention. He said you were always busy. He said he felt like a piece of furniture. I said, he felt like a piece of furniture. So he went and got an apartment and bought a car and took out a loan in my name. That was his solution. That was how he handled being lonely. She said, I didn't know about the loan. I said, you didn't know about the loan. She said, I didn't. I didn't know anything about the car. He told me it was a lease. He told me the company paid for it. I said, the company paid for it. My company. My credit. My name. She said, I didn't know. I said, you didn't know. That's what you're going to tell me. You didn't know. You didn't know he was married. You didn't know he had a wife. You didn't know he had a life. She said, I knew he was married. He told me he was separated. He told me you were living in different parts of the house. He told me you were going to divorce. I said, and you believed him. She said, I believed him. I said, that's not an excuse. That's a reason to ask more questions. You didn't ask. You didn't want to know. She looked down at the table. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I already told you I don't want an apology. She said, what do you want? I said, I want you to know what he did. I want you to know who you were with. I want you to know that the man you were sleeping with was a man who stole his wife's identity. He took out a loan in my name. He forged my signature. He put my credit on the line. He put my financial future at risk. And he did it all without telling me. That's who you were with. That's who you believed. She went pale. She said, I didn't know. I said, now you do. I stood up. I looked down at her. I said, I don't want to see you again. I don't want to talk to you again. I don't want to hear your name again. I want you to stay away from me and my family. I want you to stay away from my husband. She said, he's your ex-husband. I said, he's not my ex-husband yet. But he will be. I walked out of the coffee shop. I got in my car and drove home. I sat in the driveway and thought about what she'd said. She said he was lonely. She said he felt like a piece of furniture. She said he told her I didn't pay attention. I thought about all the years I'd been paying attention. I'd paid attention to his schedule. I'd paid attention to his meals. I'd paid attention to his moods. I'd paid attention to everything except the one thing I should have paid attention to. I'd paid attention to everything except the part of him that was gone. I went inside. I sat down at the kitchen table. I pulled out a pad of paper. I wrote down everything I knew. I wrote down the dates. I wrote down the amounts. I wrote down the addresses. I wrote down the names. I wrote it all down. I wanted to see it in front of me. I wanted to see the shape of it. I wanted to see the picture it made. I called the lawyer. I said, I want to file the petition tomorrow. She said, I'll have it ready. I said, I want a full financial accounting. I want to know where every dollar went. I want to know what he spent on her. I want to know what he spent on the apartment. I want to know what he spent on the car. I want to know everything. She said, I can do that. But it will take time. I said, I have time. I have all the time in the world. I hung up. I sat there and looked at the paper. I looked at all the pieces. I looked at the shape of the thing. It was bigger than I'd thought. It was bigger than a car. It was bigger than a loan. It was bigger than an affair. It was a life. It was a whole other life he'd built without me. And I'd been sitting in the same house, making dinner, doing laundry, thinking we were fine. I thought about the last 18 years. I thought about all the moments I'd given him. I thought about all the moments he'd taken. I thought about all the moments I'd given him and he'd given her. I thought about the math of it. The math didn't make sense. I got up. I walked to the bedroom. I opened the closet. I pulled down a box from the top shelf. I opened it. It was full of old pictures. I sat on the floor and went through them. Pictures of us at the beach. Pictures of us at weddings. Pictures of us in front of the courthouse. I looked at his face. I looked at his smile. I looked at his eyes. I tried to see the person he'd become. I couldn't see it. I couldn't find it in the pictures. I couldn't find the person who had signed my name. I put the pictures back in the box. I put the box back on the shelf. I closed the closet. I sat on the bed. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about what I was going to do next. I thought about the divorce. I thought about the money. I thought about the apartment. I thought about the woman in the coffee shop. I thought about all of it. I got up. I walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I drank it. I set the glass down. I walked back to the bedroom. I lay down on the bed. I closed my eyes. I tried to sleep. I couldn't sleep. I just lay there and looked at the dark. The phone rang. It was Tom. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. He called again. I let it ring. He left another message. I didn't listen to it. I turned the phone off. I put it in the drawer. I closed the drawer. I lay there in the dark. I thought about the woman in the coffee shop. I thought about what she'd said. I thought about the way she'd looked when I told her about the loan. I thought about the way she'd gone pale. I thought about the way she'd said, I didn't know. I believed her. I believed she didn't know. I believed he'd lied to her the same way he'd lied to me. I believed he'd told her what she needed to hear to get what he wanted. I believed he'd done the same thing to her that he'd done to me. I didn't hate her. I didn't like her. But I didn't hate her. She was just another person he'd used. She was just another person who'd believed him. She was just another person who'd found out too late. I got up. I went to the kitchen. I turned on the light. I sat at the table. I wrote down the woman's name. Monica Ortega. I wrote down the apartment address. I wrote down the credit card number. I wrote down the dates. I wrote down everything. I wanted to have a record. I wanted to have it all in one place. I wanted to be able to look at it and see the whole picture. I looked at the paper. I looked at all the pieces. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the look on Tom's face when the car lifted off the ground. I thought about the way the neighbors had watched. I thought about the video on Facebook. I thought about all of it. I thought about the hook. The one from the last part. I thought about it and I felt a small surge of satisfaction. I didn't know if it was vindication or relief. I didn't know if it was something else. It felt like something I'd been carrying for a long time was finally off my shoulders. I thought about the next thing. I thought about the divorce. I thought about the financial separation. I thought about the court proceedings. I thought about all the things I was going to have to do. I thought about all the things I was going to have to face. I didn't know if I was ready. I didn't know if I was strong enough. I didn't know if I could do it alone. I looked at the paper. I looked at my handwriting. I looked at the name at the top of the page. Claire Harding. I looked at it and I thought, you did something. You did something hard. You did something you didn't think you could do. You did it and you didn't fall apart. You did it and you're still standing. I folded the paper. I put it in my pocket. I walked back to the bedroom. I got into bed. I lay down and closed my eyes. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the look on his face. I thought about the next thing. I fell asleep. I woke up the next morning to the sound of the doorbell. I got up. I walked to the front door. I opened it. Tom was standing there. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He had dark circles under his eyes. His shirt was rumpled. He said, "Claire, we need to talk." I said, "I have nothing to say to you." He said, "Please, just give me 5 minutes." I stepped back. I let him in. He walked into the living room. He didn't sit down. He just stood there. He looked at me. He said, "I made a mistake. I made a lot of mistakes. I know that. I know I hurt you. I know I did things I shouldn't have done. I know I lied. I know I cheated. I know I took advantage of you. I know all of it. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I said, "You're sorry? That's what you came here to say?" He said, "I came here to say I want to fix it. I want to fix everything. I want to pay back the loan. I want to sell the car. I want to end it with Monica. I want to go to counseling. I want to do whatever it takes. I want to save our marriage." I said, "There's no marriage to save." He said, "Claire, please. I know I can be better. I know I can change. I know I can be the person you deserve." I said, "You don't know that. You don't know anything. You didn't know you were hurting me. You didn't know you were lying. You didn't know you were cheating. You didn't know any of it. You just did what you wanted. And now you're standing here telling me you can change. But you can't. You can't change because you don't know who you are." He said, "I know who I am." I said, "No, you don't. You think you're a good person who made a mistake. You're not. You're a person who made a series of choices. You chose to lie. You chose to cheat. You chose to take my name. You chose to take my credit. You chose to take my trust. You chose all of it. And you didn't choose it because you made a mistake. You chose it because you wanted something and you didn't care who you hurt to get it." He said, "That's not true." I said, "It is true. It's true and you know it. You knew it the whole time. You knew what you were doing. You knew it was wrong. You just didn't care." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "I want you to go. I want you to go and I want you to stay gone. I want you to sign the papers. I want you to give me the house. I want you to give me the savings. I want you to take your debt and your car and your apartment and your woman, and I want you to leave me alone." He said, "I don't want to lose you." I said, "You already lost me. You lost me the day you signed my name. You just didn't know it." He didn't leave. He stood there in the living room with his hands hanging at his sides. He looked at the floor. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at me like I was a stranger he was trying to remember. I waited. I didn't move. I didn't say anything else. I just stood there and let the silence do the work. He said, "I don't know how to be alone." I said, "You should have thought of that before you made yourself alone." He said, "I didn't mean to make myself alone. I just wanted something. I don't even know what. I just wanted something different. I wanted to feel like I mattered. I wanted to feel like someone saw me." I know that sounds stupid. I said, "It doesn't sound stupid. It sounds like an excuse. It sounds like the same thing every man says when he gets caught." I felt invisible. I felt unappreciated. I felt like you didn't love me. So I went out and found someone who did. That's what you're saying. That's what all of you say. And you never stopped to think about why you felt invisible. You never stopped to think about whether you were actually invisible or whether you just stopped looking. He said, "I did stop looking." I said, "I know. That's the point. You stopped looking. You stopped seeing me. You stopped paying attention. You stopped doing the work. And then you blamed me for it. You told Monica I didn't make you feel seen. You told her I was focused on work. You told her I was busy. You told her I didn't notice you. You told her all the things you should have told me." He said, "I didn't tell her anything about you." I said, "You told her I didn't understand you. You told her I didn't make you feel loved. You told her I was a piece of furniture. You told her I was a fixture in your life that you couldn't move. You told her you were lonely. You told her everything you were feeling. And you didn't tell me. You didn't tell me any of it. You just went out and found someone else to tell." He said, "I didn't know how to tell you." I said, you didn't know how to tell me. You didn't know how to have a conversation with your wife of 18 years. You didn't know how to say, I'm not happy. You didn't know how to say, I need something. You didn't know how to say anything. So you just did something instead. You did something that destroyed everything we had. You did something that made it impossible for me to trust you. You did something that made it impossible for me to look at you and see the person I married. He said, I still love you. I said, I don't think you know what love is. I don't think you ever knew. I think you love the idea of me. I think you love the way I made you feel. I think you love the way I took care of things. I think you love the way I made your life easier. But I don't think you ever loved me. Not really. Not the way you're supposed to love someone. He said, that's not true. I said, then tell me what you love about me. Tell me one thing. One thing that isn't about what I do for you. One thing that isn't about how I make you feel. One thing that's just me. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He said, you're smart. You're strong. You're independent. I said, those are things you admire. Those aren't things you love. Those are things you respect. And you don't even respect them. You used them. You used my strength to get what you wanted. You used my independence to make it easier for you to leave. You used my intelligence to make sure I didn't find out. You didn't love any of it. You used it. You used all of it and you didn't think twice. He said, I'm sorry I hurt you. I said, I know you're sorry. You've been sorry for days. You've been sorry since the tow truck. You've been sorry since the car was lifted. You've been sorry since you saw the look on my face. But you weren't sorry before. You weren't sorry when you signed my name. You weren't sorry when you opened the account. You weren't sorry when you drove the car off the lot. You weren't sorry when you went to the apartment. You weren't sorry when you came home and kissed me and lied to me. You weren't sorry then. You're only sorry now because you got caught. He said, that's not fair. I said, fair. You want to talk about fair? You want to talk about fairness? You forged my signature. You took out a loan in my name. You committed fraud. You committed identity theft. You put my financial future at risk. You put my credit at risk. You put my entire life at risk. And you're standing here talking about what's fair. He said, I was going to pay it back. I said, you were going to pay it back. You said that. You keep saying that. But you didn't pay it back. You didn't even make the first payment. You let it go overdue. You let the bank call me. You let me find out the way I did. You didn't do anything. You just waited. You waited for me to find out and then you waited for me to fix it. He said, I didn't expect you to fix it. I said, of course you did. You always did. You always expected me to fix it. You always expected me to smooth things over. You always expected me to make it okay. That was our marriage. That was our whole marriage. You made the mess and I cleaned it up. You said the wrong thing and I apologized for it. You spent the money and I balanced the budget. You forgot the anniversary and I told everyone it was fine. You didn't show up and I made excuses. You did all of it and I fixed all of it. And you never once thought about what it cost me. You never once thought about how much of myself I gave away to keep you comfortable. He said, I didn't know you felt that way. I said, of course you didn't. You weren't paying attention. You were never paying attention. You were too busy thinking about yourself. You were too busy thinking about what you wanted. You were too busy thinking about the next thing. You never stopped to think about me. You never stopped to think about what I needed. You never stopped to think about what I wanted. You just took and took and took and assumed I'd keep giving. He said, I'm not that person. I said, you are that person. You've always been that person. I just didn't see it. I didn't want to see it. I wanted to believe you were different. I wanted to believe you were the man I married. But you're not. You're not him. That man is gone. Or maybe he never existed. Maybe I made him up. Maybe I made up the whole thing. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. He looked at me. His eyes were wet. He was crying. I'd never seen him cry. Not like that. Not with his whole face. He said, I don't want to lose you. I said, you already lost me. I told you that. You lost me the day you signed my name. You just didn't know it. You just kept going. You kept doing what you were doing. You kept lying. You kept cheating. You kept taking. You kept assuming I'd be there when you got back. And I was. I was there. I was always there. But I'm not anymore. I'm not there and I'm not coming back. He said, what do I do? I said, I don't know. That's not my problem anymore. That's your problem. You have to figure out who you are and what you want and how to live with what you've done. You have to do that. I can't do it for you. I can't fix it for you. I can't make it okay. I can't do any of it. That's what it means to be an adult. That's what it means to be responsible. You have to do it yourself. He stood there. He looked at me. He looked like a child who'd lost his mother in a crowd. He looked lost. He looked scared. He looked like he didn't know where to go or what to do. I felt something for him. I didn't know what it was. It wasn't love. It wasn't pity. It was something else. It was recognition. I recognized him. I recognized the person he was. I recognized the person he'd always been. I said, you need to leave now. He said, can I call you? I said, no. He said, can I write to you? I said, no. He said, can I see you again? I said, no. I don't want to see you. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to hear from you. I want you to go away and I want you to stay away. I want you to sign the papers. I want you to sell the house. I want you to give me my life back. I want you to do all of it and I want you to do it without me. He said, I'll do it. I'll do whatever you want. I'll sign the papers. I'll sell the house. I'll give you the money. I'll do it all. I'll do it all and I won't ask for anything. I just want you to know I'm sorry. I want you to know I messed up. I want you to know I lost the best thing that ever happened to me. I said, I know you're sorry. I know you messed up. I know you lost me. But that's not enough. That's not going to fix anything. That's not going to make any of it right. It's just words. It's just words and I've heard all of them before. He said, I don't know what else to say. I said, there's nothing else to say. You've said everything. You've said all the things you're supposed to say. You've said you're sorry. You've said you'll change. You've said you'll do better. You've said all of it. And now you have to go. You have to go and you have to do the things you said you would do. And you have to let me go. He nodded. He walked to the door. He opened it. He looked back at me. He said, I'll call the lawyer tomorrow. I said, I'll be waiting. He left. I closed the door. I locked it. I leaned against it. I closed my eyes. I felt my body sag. I felt the weight of everything I'd just said. I felt the weight of everything I'd been carrying for weeks. I stood there for a long time. I didn't move. I just stood there and breathed. I pushed off the door. I walked to the living room. I sat down on the couch. I looked at the empty room. I looked at the quiet house. I looked at the life I'd built and the life I'd lost and the life I was going to have to build again. I didn't know how. I didn't know where to start. I just knew I had to. I picked up the phone. I called Rachel. She answered on the first ring. She said, I saw his car outside. What happened? I said, he came over. He said he was sorry. He said he wanted to fix it. I told him to leave. She said, are you okay? I said, I don't know. I think so. I'm not sad. I'm not mad. I'm just tired. I'm so tired. She said, I'm coming over. I said, no. I'm fine. I need to be alone. She said, I'm coming over with wine. I said, okay. Bring the wine. She showed up 20 minutes later with 2 bottles. She walked in and hugged me. She held on for a long time. I let her. I let myself lean into her. I let myself feel the warmth of her arms. I let myself be held. She pulled back. She said, I have wine. I have cheese. I have a bag of chips. I have everything a person needs when they just told their husband to leave. I said, I didn't just tell him to leave. I told him to leave and never come back. She said, that's even better. We need more wine. She opened a bottle. She poured 2 glasses. She handed one to me. She said, to you. I said, to me. I took a sip. I felt the warmth spread through me. I sat down on the couch. She sat down next to me. She said, tell me everything. I told her. I told her about the conversation. I told her about the words I'd said. I told her about the way he'd looked when he left. I told her about the feeling in my chest. I told her all of it. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She just nodded and drank her wine. When I was done, she said, you did the right thing. I said, I know. She said, Do you feel like you did the right thing? I said, I feel like I did the only thing I could do. She said, that's the same thing. We sat there for a while. We drank the wine. We ate the cheese. We watched the light change in the room. The sun went down. The room got dark. We didn't turn on the lights. We just sat there and let the dark settle around us. She said, what's next? I said, I don't know. I have to file the papers. I have to talk to the lawyer. I have to figure out the money. I have to figure out the house. I have to figure out everything. She said, you don't have to figure it all out tonight. I said, I know. But I can't stop thinking about it. She said, that's why I brought the wine. We drank another bottle. We talked about other things. We talked about her job. We talked about her boyfriend. We talked about her mother. We talked about everything except Tom. It was the most normal conversation I'd had in weeks. I felt like myself. I felt like the person I used to be. I felt like I was coming back. She left at midnight. She hugged me at the door. She said, call me if you need anything. I said, I will. She said, I'm serious. Anything. Middle of the night. I don't care. I said, I know. Thank you. She left. I closed the door. I locked it. I stood there in the dark. I walked to the bedroom. I changed into my pajamas. I got into bed. I lay there and looked at the ceiling. I thought about the day. I thought about the conversation. I thought about the words I'd said. I thought about the way he'd looked when he left. I thought about the empty space in the house. I thought about the hook. The one from the last part. I thought about it and I knew it was true. He'd already lost me. He just didn't know it. And now he knew. Now he knew and he was going to have to live with it. I closed my eyes. I fell asleep. I slept through the night. I didn't dream. The next morning, I woke up early. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the empty chair across from me. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel anything. I just sat there and drank my coffee and watched the sun come up. I called the lawyer at 9. Margaret answered. She said, I heard you had a visitor yesterday. I said, word travels fast. She said, your sister called me. She wanted to make sure I knew what was happening. I said, I told him to leave. I told him to sign the papers. I told him to sell the house. I told him everything. She said, how did he take it? I said, he cried. He said he was sorry. He said he loved me. He said he'd do whatever I wanted. She said, do you believe him? I said, I believe he's sorry. I believe he loves me. I believe he'll do whatever I want. But I don't believe it changes anything. I don't believe it fixes what he did. I don't believe it makes any of it right. She said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to file the papers. I want to get the house. I want to get the savings. I want to get my name off the loan. I want to get my life back. She said, I'll have the papers ready by Friday. I said, good. I'll sign them on Friday. We hung up. I sat there and looked at the phone. I thought about the papers. I thought about the house. I thought about the savings. I thought about the loan. I thought about all the things I was going to have to do. I got up. I walked to the bedroom. I opened the closet. I pulled out the box of pictures. I sat on the floor and went through them again. I looked at his face. I looked at his smile. I looked at his eyes. I looked at the man I'd married. I looked at the man he'd become. I didn't know him. I didn't recognize him. I didn't want to. I put the pictures back in the box. I put the box in the garage. I closed the door. I walked back inside. I sat down on the couch. I looked at the room. I looked at the furniture. I looked at the walls. I looked at the life I'd built. I didn't know if I was going to keep it. I didn't know if I was going to stay. I just knew I was going to make a decision. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I made a list. I wrote down everything I needed to do. Sell the house. Get a new bank account. Change the locks. Cancel the credit cards. File the papers. Get a lawyer. Move on. I wrote it all down. I looked at it. It was a long list. It was a hard list. It was a list I was going to have to work through one item at a time. I started with the bank account. I went to the bank. I opened an account in my name only. I transferred half of the savings. I changed my direct deposit. I did it all in 1 hour. I walked out of the bank and I felt lighter. I felt like I was taking control of something. I felt like I was taking back a piece of my life. I called a locksmith. I had the locks changed. I had the garage door code reset. I had the security system reprogrammed. I did it all in one afternoon. I walked through the house and I felt like it was mine. I felt like it was my house. I felt like it was my life. I canceled the credit cards. I ordered new ones. I changed my passwords. I updated all my accounts. I did it all in one evening. I sat at the kitchen table and I filled out forms and I made phone calls and I took control of everything he'd touched. I didn't stop. I kept going. I kept doing the things I needed to do. I kept taking back the pieces of my life. I kept moving forward. I didn't look back. I didn't let myself think about him. I didn't let myself wonder what he was doing. I just kept moving. On Friday, I went to the lawyer's office. I signed the papers. I looked at my signature. It was mine. It was the real one. It was the one I'd been signing for 20 years. I signed it and I thought about the other one. The one he'd forged. The one that had started all of this. I signed my name and I thought, that's mine. That's me. That's the person I am. I walked out of the lawyer's office. I got in my car. I drove home. I walked into the house. I stood in the living room. I looked at the furniture. I looked at the walls. I looked at the life I'd built. I knew I was going to sell it. I knew I was going to leave. I knew I was going to start over. I didn't know where I was going to go. I didn't know what I was going to do. I knew I was going to do it on my own. I sat down on the couch. I looked at the phone. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Tom. I thought about the words I'd said. I thought about the words he'd said. I thought about all of it. I thought about the hook. The one from the last part. I thought about it and I knew it was still true. He'd already lost me. He just didn't know it. But now he knew. Now he knew and he was going to have to live with it. I picked up the phone. I called Rachel. I said, I signed the papers. She said, how do you feel? I said, I feel like I just took the first step. She said, what's the second step? I said, I don't know yet. I'll let you know when I figure it out. She said, okay. Call me when you do. I said, I will. I hung up. I sat there. I looked at the room. I looked at the life I'd built. I looked at the life I was going to leave behind. I looked at the life I was going to build. I didn't know what it was going to look like. I didn't know where I was going to end up. I knew I was going to get there. I was going to get there one step at a time. The weeks after I signed the papers were a blur of small decisions. I met with a realtor. I listed the house. I started packing boxes. I went through every room and sorted everything into piles. Keep. Donate. Trash. I spent hours in the garage going through things we'd accumulated over 18 years. Old furniture. Holiday decorations. Boxes of photographs. I found his high school yearbook. I found my college diploma. I found the wedding album. I opened the wedding album and looked at the pictures. I looked at the two people standing in front of the courthouse. They looked young. They looked happy. They looked like they had no idea what was coming. I looked at my face. I looked at my eyes. I tried to see the person I'd become. I couldn't. I didn't recognize her. She was someone else. She was someone who hadn't been betrayed. She was someone who still believed in forever. I closed the album. I put it in the trash. I didn't want to look at it again. I didn't want to remember the person I'd been. I wanted to remember the person I was becoming. The house sold in 3 weeks. The offer was fair. I didn't negotiate. I just signed the papers and started looking for a new place. I found a small condo on the other side of town. 2 bedrooms. A balcony. A parking spot. It was smaller than the house. It was simpler. It was mine. I moved in on a Saturday. Rachel helped. She brought boxes. She brought pizza. She brought a bottle of champagne. We spent the afternoon unpacking. We hung pictures. We arranged furniture. We made the place feel like home. She said, "You're really doing this." I said, "I'm really doing this." She said, "How does it feel?" I said, "It feels like starting over." She said, "Is that a good thing?" I said, "I don't know yet. But it's the thing I'm doing. That's enough." We drank the champagne. We sat on the balcony and watched the sun go down. She looked at me. She said, I have to tell you something. I said, what? She said, I filed for divorce. I said, what? She said, I filed for divorce. I filed it 2 weeks ago. I said, why? What happened? She said, nothing happened. Nothing new. I just looked at him and I thought, you're the same person who did that to my sister. You're the same person who lied and cheated and stole. And I thought, I don't want to be married to that person. I don't want to be married to someone who could do that to anyone. I said, Rachel, you don't have to do this for me. She said, I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. I saw what he did and I thought, what if he does that to me? What if he does that to someone else? What if he does that to anyone? He's not a good person. He's not a person I want to be married to. I don't care if he hasn't done anything to me. The fact that he did it to you is enough. I said, are you sure? She said, I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything. I don't want to be married to a man who makes me wonder if he's capable of the same thing. I don't want to be married to a man who makes me look at him and think, you could do that. You could do that, and you'd probably get away with it. I said, he's not the same person. He's not Tom. She said, he's not Tom. But he's a man. And he's a man who stood by and watched Tom do what he did. He's a man who didn't say anything. He's a man who didn't do anything. He's a man who let it happen. And that's enough. That's enough for me to know I don't want to be with him. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there and looked at her. She was my sister. She was the person who had stood by me. She was the person who had brought wine and cheese and hugs. She was the person who had let me tow a car from her driveway. She was the person who had let me do the thing I needed to do. I said, I'm sorry. She said, don't be sorry. This is a good thing. This is a thing I should have done a long time ago. I just didn't have a reason. Now I do. We didn't talk about it again that night. We just sat on the balcony and watched the stars come out. We drank the rest of the champagne. We talked about other things. We talked about our mother. We talked about our jobs. We talked about the future. She left at 11. She hugged me at the door. She said, I'm proud of you. I said, I'm proud of you too. She said, we're going to be okay. I said, I know. We're going to be okay. I closed the door. I walked to the balcony. I looked out at the city. I looked at the lights. I looked at the dark. I thought about everything that had happened. I thought about the car. I thought about the loan. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the look on Tom's face. I thought about the conversation in the kitchen. I thought about all of it. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt something else. I felt something like peace. I knew it wasn't going to last. I knew there were going to be hard days ahead. I knew I was going to struggle. But I also knew I was going to survive. I knew I was going to make it. The divorce was finalized in November. I didn't go to court. I didn't need to. The papers were signed. The assets were divided. The house was sold. The money was split. The loan was discharged. It was over. It was all over. Tom moved to the other side of the state. He got a job with a different company. He left Monica. He left the apartment. He left everything. He sent me a letter. It was short. It said, I'm sorry for everything. I know that's not enough. But it's all I have. I read the letter. I folded it. I put it in a drawer. I didn't respond. Rachel's divorce went through the same week. She didn't make a big deal out of it. She just said, it's done. I'm done. We're both done. I said, we're both done. She said, what's next for you? I said, I don't know. I'm thinking about taking a trip. I'm thinking about going somewhere warm. She said, where? I said, I don't know. Somewhere I've never been. She said, take me with you. I said, okay. I'll take you with me. We planned the trip in December. We booked flights to Mexico. We found a small hotel on the beach. We packed our bags. We left on the 1st of January. We sat on the beach and watched the sun go down. We drank margaritas. We talked about the future. She said, do you ever think about him? I said, sometimes. I think about the person he used to be. I think about the person I thought he was. I think about the person he turned out to be. I think about all of it. She said, do you miss him? I said, I miss the idea of him. I miss the person I married. But that person doesn't exist. He's gone. He left a long time ago. I just didn't know it. She said, "Do you think you'll ever get married again?" I said, "I don't know. I don't know if I want to. I don't know if I need to. I don't know if I want to put myself through that again." She said, "That's fair." We sat there in silence. The waves crashed. The stars came out. The sky was huge. I felt small. I felt small and I felt free. I felt like I had room to breathe. I felt like I had room to become someone new. I thought about the trip. I thought about the beach. I thought about the warmth. I thought about all the things I'd done to get to this moment. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the look on Tom's face. I thought about the conversation in the kitchen. I thought about the hook. The one from the last part. I thought about it and I knew it was still true. He'd already lost me. He just didn't know it. But he knew now. He knew, and he was going to have to live with it. I looked at Rachel. I said, "I think I'm going to be okay." She said, "I know you are. I always knew you would be." We drank our margaritas. We watched the stars. We talked about nothing. We talked about everything. We stayed on the beach until the sun came up. The next morning, I woke up early. I went to the beach. I walked along the water. I felt the sand between my toes. I felt the warmth of the sun on my skin. I felt the salt on my lips. I felt alive. I thought about the months leading up to this moment. I thought about the bank call. I thought about the lawyer. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the conversation in the kitchen. I thought about the divorce. I thought about the house. I thought about the condo. I thought about all of it. I stopped walking. I stood there and looked out at the water. I watched the waves break. I watched the foam spread. I watched the horizon. I thought about the car. I thought about the way it looked rising off the ground. I thought about the look on his face. I thought about the way I'd stood there and watched it go. I thought about the way I'd felt. I'd felt like I was doing something I had to do. I'd felt like I was taking something back. I'd felt like I was finally seeing things clearly. I thought about Monica. I thought about the coffee shop. I thought about the conversation we'd had. I thought about the way she'd looked when I told her about the loan. I thought about the way she'd said, "I didn't know." I didn't hate her. I didn't like her. But I didn't hate her. She was just a person who'd made a mistake. She was just a person who'd believed the wrong man. She was just a person who'd found out too late. I thought about Tom. I thought about the man I'd married. I thought about the man he'd become. I thought about the man he was going to be. I didn't know him. I didn't want to know him. I didn't care what happened to him. I didn't care if he was happy. I didn't care if he was sad. I didn't care if he was okay. I didn't care. I walked back to the hotel. Rachel was sitting on the balcony. She had coffee. She had pastries. She said, "I got breakfast." I said, "I'm not hungry." She said, "Eat something. You've been walking for 2 hours." I said, "I know." She said, "What were you thinking about?" I said, "I was thinking about everything. I was thinking about the car. I was thinking about the tow truck. I was thinking about the barbecue. I was thinking about Tom. I was thinking about Monica. I was thinking about all of it." She said, and I said, "And I'm done thinking about it. I'm done. I've thought about it enough. I've thought about it for months. I've thought about it every day. And I'm done." She said, "That's a good thing." I said, "I know it is." We ate breakfast. We talked about the day. We talked about the beach. We talked about the trip. We talked about everything except the past. We talked about the future. We talked about what we were going to do next. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a goal. I didn't have anything except a hotel room on a beach in Mexico and a sister who loved me. And that was enough. That was more than enough. We spent the rest of the week on the beach. We swam. We walked. We read. We drank. We talked. We laughed. We didn't think about anything else. We just lived. On the last day, I sat on the balcony and watched the sun go down. I thought about the trip. I thought about the beach. I thought about the warmth. I thought about all the things I'd done to get to this moment. I thought about the hook. The one from the last part. I thought about it and I knew it was time to let it go. It wasn't a hook anymore. It was a memory. It was a memory of a person I used to be. It was a memory of a time I'd survived. It was a memory of something I'd done that I didn't know I could do. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the look on his face. I thought about the way I'd stood there and watched it go. I thought about the way I'd felt. I felt proud. I felt proud of myself. I felt proud of what I'd done. I felt proud of the person I'd become. I felt proud of the person I was still becoming. I went inside. Rachel was on the bed. She was reading. She looked up. She said, "What's that look on your face?" I said, "What look?" She said, "That look. That look like you just figured something out." I said, "I just figured something out." She said, "What?" I said, "I figured out that I'm okay. I figured out that I'm going to be okay. I figured out that I don't need him. I don't need anyone. I just need myself." She said, "That's a good thing to figure out." I said, "It is. It's the best thing I've figured out in a long time." I lay down on the bed. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the look on his face. I thought about all of it. I closed my eyes. I felt the warmth of the sun on my skin. I felt the sound of the waves in my ears. I felt the peace settle in my chest. I was okay. I was going to be okay. I was going to be fine. We came back from Mexico in the middle of January. The air was cold and wet. The sky was gray. I stood in the airport parking lot and looked at my car and thought about how different everything was. I was different. I was the same person who had walked through that door 3 weeks ago. But I wasn't. Something had shifted. Rachel drove me home. She pulled into the parking lot of my condo and turned off the engine. She said, "You sure you don't want to come to my place? I have wine. I have leftovers. I have a couch you can sleep on." I said, "I want to go home. I want to sleep in my own bed. I want to wake up in my own place." She said, "Okay. But call me if you need anything." I said, "I will." She hugged me. I got out of the car. I walked up the stairs to my condo. I unlocked the door. I stepped inside. It was quiet. It was empty. It was mine. I walked through the rooms. I touched the furniture. I looked out the windows. I stood on the balcony and looked at the city. The lights were coming on. The sky was getting dark. I went to bed early. I lay there and listened to the sounds of the building. The neighbors moving upstairs. The heat clicking on. The wind outside the window. I felt safe. I felt alone. I felt okay. The next morning, I woke up early. I made coffee. I sat on the balcony and watched the sun come up. I thought about the trip. I thought about the beach. I thought about the warmth. I thought about all the things I'd left behind. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the look on his face. I thought about the way I'd stood there and watched it go. I thought about the way I'd felt. I felt strong. I felt like I could do anything. I felt like I'd already done the hardest thing I'd ever have to do. The next few weeks were quiet. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner. I watched TV. I read books. I went for walks. I lived my life. I didn't think about Tom. I didn't think about Monica. I didn't think about the apartment. I didn't think about the loan. I didn't think about any of it. I just lived. Rachel called me every few days. She was doing the same thing. She was living her life. She was moving on. She was becoming someone new. She said, "I think I'm going to start dating again." I said, "Are you ready for that?" She said, "I don't know. But I think I need to try. I think I need to see what's out there." I said, "I think that's a good idea." She said, "What about you? Are you going to start dating again?" I said, "I don't think so. I'm not ready. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. I don't know if I want to be." She said, "That's fair." We hung up. I sat there and thought about what she'd said. I thought about dating. I thought about relationships. I thought about trust. I didn't know if I could trust anyone again. I didn't know if I wanted to. I didn't know if I needed to. I went to bed. I slept. I woke up. I went to work. I came home. I lived my life. The divorce was finalized. I didn't think about it. It was just a thing that had happened. It was a thing I'd survived. It was a thing I'd moved on from. It was a thing I didn't think about anymore. I threw myself into work. I took on extra projects. I stayed late. I came in early. I did the things I'd been putting off. I focused on my career. I focused on my future. I got a promotion in March. I was the new department head. I got an office with a window. I got a raise. I got a parking spot. I got the things I'd been working toward. I didn't know if I deserved them. I knew I'd earned them. I'd earned them with hard work and focus and dedication. I'd earned them by not giving up. I'd earned them by staying the course. I'd earned them by being the person I'd always been. I thought about Tom. I thought about the years I'd spent with him. I thought about the years I'd spent taking care of him. I thought about the years I'd spent putting his needs before mine. I thought about all the years I'd wasted. I didn't feel sad. I felt something else. I felt like I'd been given a second chance. I felt like I'd been given a chance to do things differently. I called Rachel. I said, I got the promotion. She said, I know. I heard. Your office called me. They wanted to make sure I knew. They said you didn't tell anyone. I said, I wanted to wait until it was official. She said, it's official. You're the boss. I said, I'm the boss. She said, how does it feel? I said, it feels like I finally know what I'm supposed to be doing. She said, that's a good thing. I said, it is. It's the best thing I've felt in a long time. The months passed. The weather got warm. The trees turned green. The flowers bloomed. I kept moving forward. I kept living my life. I kept becoming someone new. I got a call in August. It was from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message later. It was a woman's voice. She said, this is Monica Ortega. I know you don't want to talk to me, but I wanted to call and tell you something. I didn't know about the loan. I didn't know about the car. I didn't know about any of it. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for what he did. I'm sorry for all of it. I hope you're okay. I hope you're doing well. I listened to the message 3 times. I didn't call her back. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I'd already forgiven her. I'd already moved on. I didn't have anything else to say. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the look on his face. I thought about the way I'd stood there and watched it go. I thought about the way I'd felt. I felt good. I felt like I'd done the right thing. I felt like I'd done the thing I needed to do. I felt like I'd taken back my life. I thought about the hook. The one from the last part. I thought about it and I knew it was time to let it go. It wasn't a hook anymore. It was a story. It was a story I'd survived. It was a story I'd told myself. It was a story I'd moved on from. I didn't think about Tom. I didn't think about Monica. I didn't think about the apartment. I didn't think about the loan. I didn't think about any of it. I just lived my life. The next call came in September. It was from Tom. I didn't recognize the number. I answered anyway. He said, Claire. It's Tom. I said, I know. He said, I'm sorry to call. I know you don't want to talk to me. I just wanted to tell you something. I said, what? He said, I got help. I went to therapy. I've been going for 6 months. I've been working on myself. I've been trying to understand what I did. I've been trying to understand why I did it. I didn't say anything. I just listened. He said, I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't make it right. I know I can't get you back. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to be the person I should have been. I'm trying to be someone you could be proud of. I said, that's not my job anymore. It's not my job to be proud of you. It's not my job to help you be better. It's not my job to fix you. It's not my job to do anything for you. It's your job. It's always been your job. You just didn't want to do it. He said, I know. I know that now. I said, I'm glad you're getting help. I'm glad you're trying. But I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to know about it. I don't want to be a part of it. I don't want to be a part of your life. I don't want you to call me. I don't want you to write to me. I don't want you to think about me. I don't want you to try to get back into my life. I don't want any of it. He said, I understand. I said, goodbye, Tom. He said, goodbye, Claire. I hung up. I sat there and looked at the phone. I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel anything. I just sat there and looked at the phone, and then I put it down and I went back to living my life. The next week, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Tom's lawyer. It was a settlement offer. He was offering to pay back the loan. He was offering to cover the legal fees. He was offering to pay for the damage he'd done. I didn't accept the offer. I didn't need to. The loan was already discharged. The legal fees were already paid. The damage was already done. I didn't need his money. I didn't need anything from him. I'd already moved on. I called Rachel. I told her about the letter. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to let it sit there. I'm not going to respond. I don't need his money. I don't need anything from him." She said, "That's a good thing." I said, "I know. I'm done. I'm done with him. I'm done with all of it." We talked for a while. She told me about her new boyfriend. She told me about her job. She told me about her life. She was doing well. She was moving on. She was becoming someone new. She said, "You sound different." I said, "I am different." She said, "What changed?" I said, "I don't know. I think I just finally realized that I'm okay. I'm okay on my own. I'm okay without him. I'm okay without anyone. I'm just okay." She said, "That's a good thing." I said, "It is. It's the best thing." I hung up. I sat there and thought about everything that had happened. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the look on his face. I thought about the way I'd stood there and watched it go. I thought about the way I'd felt. I felt proud. I felt proud of myself. I felt proud of what I'd done. I felt proud of the person I'd become. I felt proud of the person I was still becoming. I didn't need to see him again. I didn't need to talk to him again. I didn't need anything from him. I'd already given myself everything I needed. I'd given myself the space to grow. I'd given myself the time to heal. I'd given myself the chance to become someone new. I thought about the ending. I thought about the conversation. I thought about the kitchen. I thought about the words I'd said. I'd told him I was done. I'd told him I wasn't coming back. I'd told him he'd already lost me. I'd told him everything I needed to tell him. I didn't have anything else to say. I didn't have any more words. I'd said it all. I'd said everything I needed to say. There was nothing left. There was only the future. There was only the life I was going to build. There was only the person I was going to become. I walked to the balcony. I stood there and looked at the city. The lights were on. The traffic was moving. The world was going about its business. I was part of it. I was part of the world. I was part of something bigger than myself. I thought about the car. I thought about the tow truck. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the look on his face. I thought about the way I'd stood there and watched it go. I thought about the way I'd felt. I felt something. I felt a surge of vindication. I felt a surge of pride. I felt a surge of something I couldn't name. It was a good feeling. It was a feeling of being seen. It was a feeling of being heard. It was a feeling of being known. I knew who I was. I knew what I'd done. I knew what I'd survived. I knew what I was capable of. I knew I could do anything. I turned away from the balcony. I walked inside. I closed the door. I walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I sat down at the table. I looked at the room. I looked at the life I'd built. I looked at the person I'd become. I thought about the hook. The one from the last part. I thought about it and I knew it was time to let it go. It wasn't a hook anymore. It was a thing I'd done. It was a thing I'd survived. It was a thing I'd moved on from. I thought about Tom. I thought about the years we'd spent together. I thought about the good times. I thought about the bad times. I thought about all of it. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel anything. I just felt like I'd closed a chapter. I felt like I'd finished a book. I felt like I was ready to start a new one. I got up. I walked to the bedroom. I changed into my pajamas. I got into bed. I lay there and looked at the ceiling. I thought about everything that had happened. I thought about everything I'd done. I thought about everything I was going to do. I closed my eyes. I let myself drift. I let myself sleep. I woke up the next morning and I felt different. I felt lighter. I felt like something had been lifted. I felt like I'd finally let go of the weight I'd been carrying. I got up. I made coffee. I sat on the balcony. I watched the sun come up. I watched the city wake up. I watched the new day begin. I thought about the hook. The one from the last part. I thought about it and I smiled. It was a good hook. It was a hook that had led me to where I was. It was a hook that had helped me become who I was. It was a hook that I was ready to let go of. I finished my coffee. I put the cup in the sink. I walked to the door. I opened it. I stepped outside. I was ready for the day. I was ready for the week. I was ready for the month. I was ready for the year. I was ready for the rest of my life.